Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I love seeing some of your faces up here and your names, and might even drop in on your breakout rooms later to say hi. I am really honored to spend this afternoon with you, especially knowing that most of you are headed back into the school buildings on Monday. I know this is a really intense time for leaders in British Columbia, and it's my hope that this hour we have together will actually offer you some tools, some approaches and strategies that might help you as you reopen your schools in the next couple of weeks. So just thank you for joining us and welcome to this experience. To get us connected, I'd love to take a moment for you to just use the chat to introduce yourselves, name, role, and organization or district. And then I wonder if there's a child or a family that kind of brought you to this space this afternoon that you're thinking about as you think about this topic of reaching students and families at the margins. So let's take a moment to just kind of hear who's here with us using that wonderful chat function. Welcome, Penny. And if folks probably know where to find the chat, but there should be a bar at the bottom. If you don't see chat, you can click the 3 little dots, and then if you look above that, there should be a chat option. So Natalie is here, a counselor from Nanaimo, Durban from Vancouver, Cindy, principal of SD 93, Lara from Surrey. It's coming fast, it's the chat waterfall. Karma, welcome. Sheila from Campbell River, welcome. So a lot of principals and VPs, of course. Diane from North Vancouver. Tammy from the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt. Kathy from Fraser Valley, Adventist Academy, wonderful. Another leader from Nanaimo, Carrie. Tara from Coquitlam. I went to a wonderful workshop at BCSSA from Coquitlam. Great job if you were part of that. David, president of BC PVPA. Welcome. Awesome. So if you were drawn to this topic because of particular students or families that you're thinking about how to reach out and connect to, how to bring in to the circle of your community and your school, I want you to just hold that child or family in your mind as we move through this hour together and really kind of nest them in your heart for this time we have together. Want to begin with a territorial acknowledgement, a practice and ritual I learned from you all in my time in British Columbia. And just note that this session is hosted on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Ohlone people of the Bay Area. Beautiful lands. I am located in Oakland, California. And just give thanks to the First Nations people here for the opportunity to gather virtually and to learn on this land. And as we move into this Zoom world together and continue to kind of navigate and figure it out together, I'm always thinking about how do we create a safe and healing space. And not just in this hour we have together, but as you go out into your school communities and connect with colleagues and connect with students and families, how do you create safe and healing spaces? So a few Zoom kind of norms that I would offer are to use that active speaker view until you move into breakout sessions. I think you are muted, but you'll have a chance to talk to each other soon. And then continue, as Kevin said, to use the chat to surface questions. And in some ways, more importantly, I really want to model for you the importance of having some agreements as you work through these virtual spaces together. I call them conscious agreements, so that we're mindful about the ways in which we're engaging each other in virtual spaces as much as in our face-to-face spaces. And these are the 5 I offer you today that you might come to this listening to each other for heart and for meaning, right? With our affective side and our cognitive side, that in the breakout rooms, you make space for others, but you also take space. So if if breakout rooms create some anxiety from you, or if you tend to be a little bit more of an introvert, I invite you to lean in and try to have some conversation with folks today. We're going to ask our students to do that most likely, and it's good to practice being courageous with each other. To have grace with yourself and each other. This is a brave new world that we're entering, to show up and engage because your voice matters. And then I always like to say your pets, your kids, your humanity, photo bombs in the background, it's all welcome. You may hear my puppy barking in a few minutes. I'm not even going to apologize for that, because this is what it is right now, right? We're working from home. We're figuring this out together. So all of that is welcome. That's part of your whole personhood, and it's welcome in this community today. All right. Who am I? Some of you may have read The Listening Leader and know a bit about my background. I'll just give a couple notes. I've been in the field for about 25 years, first as a high school teacher in San Francisco and Oakland, then as a principal, like many of you, of a small public school called June Jordan School for Equity. And then for the last about 12 years as an equity coach and facilitator, doing this work across the country and in Canada. I had the chance to teach abroad in Amman, Jordan. You might recognize upper right here, that's Petra, one of the ancient civilizations in the southern part of Jordan. And that was a wonderful experience I had about 10 years ago. So before I unpack this graphic, I actually wanted to read from you all a passage from the book, from the introduction, The Listening Leader, about what this notion of listening leadership means. Listening is a vital and overlooked tool and the cornerstone of leading across differences in race, gender, culture, socioeconomic status, language, and age, among other factors. Listening leaders use their ears and their eyes to understand where people are coming from. They lead with questions more than answers, and they demonstrate care, curiosity, and regard for every person who crosses their path. But listening leadership extends well beyond the act of listening. It is also an orientation toward collegiality, shared leadership, professional growth, and equity. It is a mindset and a way of being. I offer you that because I think we're in a moment where so many things are unknown, and our usual tools and ways of leading, our plans and our checklists, and some of our more technical modalities aren't necessarily always what we need in this moment. And so today I invite you to really entertain this notion of listening leadership as a set of lenses that you can apply to every part of your work as a school leader. From an individual lens and thinking about listening to yourself in this moment and really getting clear and grounded in who do I want to be as a leader right now? Who does my community need me to be? And what matters to me? As an interpersonal lens, as you think about listening to your students and your families and your staff, who are my teachers and my students and what matters to them right now? As a structural lens, as you think about listening to your institution and really trying to diagnose where those equity gaps are and how you can strategize to close or begin to bridge some of the gaps that young people at the margins are feeling and experiencing. And then lastly, in some ways, most importantly, as a pedagogical lens, I really want us to think together about how we're centering student voice and elevating the voices of students, no matter what model of distance learning, hybrid, or face-to-face we're in. How will we not become sort of transactional in our pedagogy, but apply this lens of listening leadership to center student voice and student agency? I want to note that love this graphic of the kitty looking in the mirror and seeing the lion. It can be very, very tempting to jump to the structural fixes, right? Or even to jump to the pedagogical fixes. And if there's one thing I've learned from 25 years in the field, it's that the work always starts within. We can only lead for equity up to the point that we've done our own internal work. And that takes some courage, hence the lion. And that takes some slowing down and really reflecting on who we are and what we believe and what we want to carry our community through in this moment. So to do that, we're going to engage in a little practice in breakout sessions in a moment around the skill of deep listening. Chapter 5 of the book is all about deep listening and 3 stances that sit underneath that. Those stances are attention to nonverbal communication, mature empathy, and affirmation. And I really see this practice of deep listening as the sort of foundation of building trust across difference and a foundation for equity work. Nikki Giovanni, incredible poet from the US, says that she understands that while language is a gift, listening is a responsibility. And I think that's true now more than ever. How do we hold that responsibility, even as we have, exceedingly long checklists and things to take care of and safety protocols to manage? The guidelines I'm going to offer you when you move into breakout rooms, facilitated by my co-pilot Kevin, is to unmute, and if you feel comfortable turning on your video, you don't feel like you're forced to do that, but I think it's nice in the smaller groups if you feel okay to share your face. You're going to have equal time to talk in that small space, about 1.5 minutes each. I'm going to invite you in this practice to listen without interrupting or advising. That can be really challenging. We often want to fix the issues that are coming up, but now I just want you to hold space for what folks have to say and share. And lastly, in the small group, to maintain confidentiality. So those are our guidelines for our circle we're about to do. And if you've been sitting a lot today, I actually want to encourage you to consider standing during the listening circle. You can tilt your screen so folks can see you. I think one of the challenges of the Zoom world is that we're spending a lot of time glued to our seats, and it's not always healthy physically or ergonomically. The goal here is to maintain a safe and healing space. You'll have 1.5 minutes to share per person. I'm just going to say your name, your role in your organization, and here's the prompt I want you to reflect on. What have you been learning about yourself as a leader through this global moment? Take a couple seconds to think about that. What have I been learning about myself as a leader in this moment? I will share that I've been learning about myself that uncertainty is extremely hard for me. And we have nothing but uncertainty right now. I find it very activating at times. I want answers. I want to know what the fall is going to look like. And so I want to give you a chance to think about, what have you been learning about yourself? So Kevin, if you want to go ahead and move folks in, and then maybe cue them after 3 or 4 minutes. So one thing I want to note about this is the component around nonverbal communication and how that manifests in a virtual space. So I want you to think about what percentage of meaning, when you're in a communication like this that has some emotion or vulnerability in it, what percentage of meaning do you imagine is conveyed by the spoken word? Just think about that for a second. If I had to guess what percentage, welcome to chat it if you want. Wondering about that. 13%, Sheila says. Any other guesses? 20%, Pam says. 25%. Okay, you guys are more optimistic than Americans. They tend to go to 5% right away. So here's the thing. I did research on this for the book, Robert Mehrabian, Foundational Research on Nonverbal Communication. He's a neuroscientist, and this is what he found. That when we're engaged in an emotional communication, which I would posit that most of our conversations right now has some emotion at the core, only 7% is coming down to the spoken word. 38% is attributed to our tone, and a majority to our nonverbal cues. I think this is really transformative information. It's guided a lot of the work I do and the time I spend, not just orchestrating words and messages, which are incredibly important, but also getting present and centered so that my tone and my face and my body language is also conveying warmth and care for other people. But, there's cultural differences to this as well. So we have cultures that are high context, where the listener is doing a lot of inference, right? Things are more indirect in communication, a little more ambiguous. And you really depend on those contextual clues like body language, like nonverbal, to understand what the person means. And on the other hand, we have low context cultures where emphasis is really placed on the word, right? That 7% might be amplified in a low context cultural context or setting. You don't have to make a lot of inferences because what is meant is the same as what is said. And I raise this because in this virtual world, we don't have access to the same level of nonverbal cues as we do when we're face-to-face. We don't have access to what I would call neuroception, right? Or kind of subtle neurological understanding or perception of what people are communicating. So if you take eye contact, it might be expected in a video conference that people are looking at each other. And culturally, that might be really off-putting for some of your community members. It might signal confrontation for some cultures. So how do we hold space for that, right? The subtle cultural differences when we don't have the full complement of nonverbal communication that we normally do. And again, we're in this virtual reality. We're using Zoom, and maybe you all are using Google Classroom, and we're taking attendance virtually, and we're on YouTube. And that these platforms are really powerful, and yet they often lack nonverbal nuance. They may not be culturally congruent for many students and families, and they can feel dehumanizing at times. So how do we just attend to that and be aware of that as we work our way through them? All right, to close this piece, I just want to note page 108 of the book, there's this graphic about relational capital and the notion that the more you listen deeply to those in your community, the more capital, relational capital you build with them. And you're going to, at some point, need to make withdrawals from this account, if you will. And you want to have something there, right? You want to have made an investment in the piggy bank so that when you have to ask people maybe to go out of school again, or parents to partner with you around challenges their students are facing, there's some investment in the bank. So we're going to talk about ways to do that, ways to kind of operationalize deep listening and build relational capital as we move on here. This deep listening practice allows us to move at the speed of trust. So I just want you to take a minute and think about kind of what's resonating with you. If there are questions that are bubbling up, we will have Q&A at the end. So take just the next few seconds to think about, what is this making me think about? What questions are emerging for me? All right, fantastic. So I want to think about data and what does it mean to rethink data in the COVID-19 moment. For me, this notion of working toward equity, it's a journey. It's a lifelong, career-long proposition. And oftentimes our data, our metrics make it seem like something we might just arrive at. When we're on that journey, I like to think about it as working toward equity, a process we're in where we're trying to eliminate predictability, right? We're trying to not know when a student walks into our buildings that they will succeed or they will fail, that they will end up in this program or that program, that they will end up in the alternative school or the mainstream school. We don't want things to be predictable for young people. We also want to be in a space of courage around examining our biases in the buildings, our own and our colleagues, and just interrupting inequitable practices as they surface. And finally, we want to be able to cultivate, this is like why we get into education, the unique brilliance and passion of every child, and I would say every adult in the building. And how do we do that? How do we do that when our conditions are shifting, right? When these protocols are being put into place? How do we continue to embrace this gift of cultivating the brilliance and passion of every person? I think one of the metaphors that's really helped me over time stay rooted in being an equity-centered leader is the notion of the birdcage. The birdcage is a metaphor I speak to in chapter 3 of the book, and it's really a metaphor for structural racism and the ways in which different sort of structures and institutions intersect with each other to keep students from opportunity. So if you read the bars of this birdcage, you see distribution of jobs, residential segregation patterns, school segregation patterns, access to quality transportation or food or healthcare. Of course, that's extremely different in your country than in mine, and that's playing out, I think, in our pandemic data, access to childcare. But we still know that there are students who are really furthest from opportunity because of where they sit at the intersection of these wires. And in distance learning, we have a whole new set of challenges or wires being revealed. Who has had Wi-Fi at home? Who has computer access at home? Whose parents are essential workers, right? Which children are struggling most with depression and or anxiety that's often exacerbated by the isolation of this moment? What if there's abuse in the home and they can't leave? How are our ELs and our students with learning differences accessing the content if they don't have a paraprofessional or instructional aid with them? Should we grade homework? I think of homework often serves as a bar on the cage inside our schools. Many students really struggle with it. Should we grade at all, right? So when we think about this journey of working toward equity, I think at the same time, we need to hold the companion metaphor of the birdcage and really acknowledge and analyze where students are sitting with respect to these wires and how we can organize ourselves to pry open as many wires as possible. All right, so I'm going to share a couple of ideas with you around data, but I want to start with some student voices. So if we're trying to figure out how to reopen schools in an equitable and student-centered way, here's my first piece of advice. Ask the students, listen to the students, and design with the students. I'm going to share a brief clip from an interview I did this week. It's 2 students from Abbotsford School District. I had the privilege of connecting with them live in Vancouver in late January, and then I reconnected with them this week. They're brother and sister. They were part of a panel of Indigenous learners that I facilitated in January. And I wanted to follow up and just get their wisdom about this experience, what they've gone through, and what they would say to educators. So let's hear their voices, Gabriel and Caitlin.
There will be some form of schooling, whether it's all online or all in person or something in between. And as educators are, grappling with how to build a model for that, what advice would you offer? What do you think they should be considering or thinking about?
I feel like they should be more empathetic towards their students, be more understanding.
I want to encourage you as you listen to jot down any words or phrases that jump out at you.
Especially the mainstream schools, because I noticed that as I went to an alternative school, every single teacher is checking up on you, hey, what's up?
Mm-hmm. And being in elementary school, I actually had a bad experience because of it. The bad experience was that I was struggling, but I didn't know who or where to go to or who to trust to help me get my mental health up or my grades. And they didn't even care to talk to me. They didn't even really care to really try anything with me. They just kind of would just they just didn't they had other students to focus on, you know what I mean? I feel like maybe we need more staff, more support, more guidance counselors or stuff like that, more therapists, more counseling. I feel like counseling is the biggest one.
So again, I encourage you to just capture words, phrases, and ideas in the next few slides, because you're going to have a chance to go into one more breakout room and kind of debrief what you heard. Want to note that was a really simple form of data gathering. It was just a Zoom call, right? I recorded it with permission, and then I captured a few different snippets. I shared one with you of what young people have to say about what's important when we go back to school. What kind of data do we need right now? In the States, I think less so in Canada, but still to some extent, we've been really obsessed for the last 2 decades with what I call satellite data that's very far from the student experience. For you, that would be maybe the FSA, attendance data, graduation rates, these kind of metrics, right, that we can think about to evaluate success. And they're important, right? They give us some sense of patterns, but they're pretty far and distant, if you will, from the student experience. And then a little further toward the ground, we have level 2 map data, which is sort of your GPS of your school community. And so you might be using student surveys or common assessments or faculty surveys to kind of ascertain what's people's level of stress right now, what do they need when they come back, how connected to young people feel to their teachers or not. And that's really powerful data too. That can give us a little bit clearer sense of what's happening inside our communities. But the data that I want to encourage you to be thinking about and actively gathering as you return to school in the next few weeks is what I call street data. Street level data is ground level data that you can only gather through listening and observation. I'm going to give you some different examples in a couple minutes, but it might include on the pedagogical side, something like a capstone project where a student presents their work, or a discussion in class where you're listening in as a principal or an assistant principal, even in a Zoom breakout room and hearing what young people are talking about. It might include a focus group or an interview like I just did with Gabriel and Caitlin to capture student stories and experiences and perspectives. And it might include artifacts like student work that you're analyzing to see in this moment, how are students doing on writing, right? How are they doing on mathematical problem solving? And we're going to talk about more examples of that, but I want you to really think about what would it mean to lead through this lens of listening and also actively gathering street data from young people in the community. Street level data is qualitative in nature, right? It's not quantitative like the satellite data. And I like to say that it emerges at our eye level and on the kind of lower, more subtle frequencies when we train our brains to discern it. And there are many types of street data. Story is one. Artifacts are another, as I alluded to. Observations are yet another. I'm sure you gather some of these organically, right? Particularly if you're doing learning walks or instructional rounds, those are forms of observation. But I want to offer you some new ways to think about gathering this type of data. One more short video. This is actually on the pedagogical side of the listening leadership quadrants. Danny is a senior at a high school in the Bay Area from a very innovative network of schools called Envision. And they graduate their students by portfolio, similar to a capstone, and the students do a defense, a portfolio defense in order to graduate. So they've just converted that whole thing to a virtual process. They call it a college success portfolio. So you'll hear Danny refer to a CSP. And if you're not a high school person, I want you to think about, what would it be like to do a middle school success portfolio or to do an elementary school success portfolio? This doesn't have to only exist at the 12th grade year. It just happens to be the example that we're hearing.
Hi, my name is Danielle Martin, and I'm a senior at Impact Academy of Arts and Technology. In this video, I will be talking about my process, my progress, and my feelings towards CSP. Since CSP has been moved virtually, I feel the weight lifted off of my shoulders just a little bit. The pressure is still there. And the way that I will be approaching a CSP is the same energy as if I were to present it in person in classroom. In my opinion, I don't think there is anything negative about the changes of the requirements, because now the requirements have been changed, and I feel like students can have that trigger in their mind that they can do this and that it is possible for them to finish CSP. What I also like about the requirement change of CSP is that students can talk about the pandemic. The pandemic is affecting everybody's lives in different ways. So if students choose to present about the pandemic, the audience gets to see how the pandemic has been affecting that particular student.
So this is something that helps me figure out what I'm going to do for CSP. It's just a little organization chart, and I brainstorm and I write what I really want to talk about in my pandemic slides. Here's a sneak peek of what my CSP slides are going to look like and how do I build them. So on the left side, I have my benchmark slides, and I use this sometimes to build off of to create my CSP slides. So what I mean by that is they're both title pages right now. This is my agenda, and on my CSP is the agenda. Then on my third slide is the about me, and on my third slide also on my benchmark. So you get the gist of it. And it also just has the same placements of things like the thesis, and I also need to remember what I need to do to put in the slides for the artifact, because when you put the artifact in the slides, you need to state the competency, the essential question, context, content, and the leadership skills that I used, and the evidence. So I just used this to build off of to create my CSP slides. And now that the requirements have changed, this is a little bit easier for me to do. But now all I need to do, once again, is just plug in the missing pieces of my CSP slides.
Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Danny is wonderful. I've gotten to spend some time with her, and she's just so sharp and mature and articulate. I wanted to share that one video with you for a couple of reasons. First of all, I just think it's a great example of street data and a great example of listening leadership applied to the pedagogical arena, right? Where student voice is really centered and the student is empowered to tell the story of their learning. Secondly, because of your competency-based curriculum, that example, that kind of modality feels so well aligned to what you're trying to do curricularly as a province. And, you know, what if the last month of school were students doing college, middle school, or elementary school success portfolios and really sharing and reflecting on what their experience has been of the last couple months? They've been part of this historical moment, and let's let them think about that. So we don't have time for a long journal, but just take a moment, think about kind of what stood out to you from Danny's reflections and her CSP presentation, because you'll get a chance to reflect on that in your small group in a minute. And really also thinking about, well, what is the impact of these street level data pieces? You know, when I sit and I listen and kind of take in student voice, whether it's Gabriel and Caitlin's advice or Danny's kind of narration of her CSP process, how does that impact me as a leader, right? What does it mean to me? I'm going to give you a couple more examples and then set you off into your breakout rooms. So a few ways you can gather listening campaign, street data in the next few weeks is you can do a listening campaign. You can do this with any set of stakeholders, students, faculty, parents. When we're talking about at the margins, I would encourage you to think of that birdcage and think about who do we need to listen to first, right? Who are the young people that I'm most concerned about and that I want to hear from? So you might ask just a few questions. What's working about this model right now that we're in, or about the return to school? What's not working for you? What's one change you would like to make to our current model? And then I like to ask questions that are forward facing, like if you could dream big, what's an idea you have for the fall? So very simple. This is, you could be one-on-one or small group listening campaign, but it's a way of capturing this qualitative data. Great to do it with a team, with your leadership team, and then bring all the data to the center of the table and do some analysis. What are the patterns we're hearing from young people? So simple and so powerful. Another idea is to do a Kiva panel, which could be virtual or could be live, where you get a set of 5 to 6 scholars. They could be, in this case, this is the Abbotsford panel I mentioned of Indigenous learners. It could be that you talk with, LGBTQ students. It could be students with learning differences, or it could be a cross section. And you ask questions of them. And you can do this virtually through a webinar, a Zoominar, and really try to center their voices and their experiences. Some of the questions I asked this group of young people: share and reflect on a powerful, deep learning experience. Share something about your life journey that has shaped you and that your educators wouldn't know just by meeting you. Whew, that was heart-wrenching, some of what came out there. So powerful. What is one element of your community's cultural wealth that you value and are proud of? How could our schools do a better job of uplifting that? And then if you could wave a magic wand to create more equity and inclusion for Indigenous learners in your district, what would you change or add and why? And man, that was an hour of time with all the secondary principals and APs from that district, and the impact was so powerful, so profound. So I encourage you to think about this. There's actually a tool on my website with these questions. It's a journaling tool that I always give the young people the questions in advance. And there's a description of this process in the book as well. So that's another way to gather street data. And then a final couple ideas, real simple: student design challenge. Why not ask students to do some work in small groups? They could design or prototype a design for the first week of school. Help us design the ideal school day, right? If it's a hybrid model or a face-to-face model. Help us design a homework policy that feels equitable, or a virtual capstone project. Or what if we actually listen to them about what they think a COVID safety plan for return to school would look like? They know a lot about social distancing and what makes it easy or hard. So it's some simple ways to really capture student brilliance and voice as we think about these incredibly complex design challenges that we're all facing right now. We're going to move into breakout rooms for just a few minutes and then come back for Q&A. So as you head to your breakout room, which Kevin will move you into, you'll just have, again, about a minute and a half to share. You can introduce yourself, because I imagine you'll be with new people. I could be wrong. He might be putting you back in the same ones. And just share maybe one thing that feels exciting about this approach and one thing that feels challenging. I mean, there's so much discomfort in this moment, right? Psychic, physical, so much anxiety and fear that if folks were unable to get over the hump of shifting toward competency-based curriculum, maybe that discomfort can be a catalyst, right? For saying, like, I'm already completely unmoored from what I thought it meant to be a teacher. Okay, let's work together, right? And I do think this deep listening practice for teachers in your community that are struggling to make that shift, taking time to listen to them, taking time to kind of uplift and cultivate their thinking around what could be possible right now is gonna give you a lot of mileage. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope that breakout room felt interesting and dynamic and helped you reflect on what I've been talking about today. A couple closing slides, and then I want to just open it up to any questions you have. First of all, just the simple notion that street data is everywhere, right? The satellite data, we have to wait, oftentimes lagging information, but the street data, we just have to attune our ears and attune our hearts to look and listen and observe, whether it's audio interviews or student design challenges, or I didn't talk about cultural wealth projects where we really affirm parents as first teachers and all their knowledge they can bring to their young people. So many ways to capture this data, and we're going to need it because we know things are continuing to change all the time, and that will happen through the end of the school year and through the fall. So how do we access this kind of data to just be nimble and responsive? That street data can help us humanize the process of data gathering, disrupt single stories about students, right, that might come with a diagnosis or a designation or an identity, disrupt implicit biases that may be lurking around about our young people. And it helps us engage in really rapid, quick cycles of improvement, right, as we go back in this complex setting. So I want you to just think about, as we move toward closing, what's one way that you might gather street data in the next few weeks. Feel free to chat that so people can see what you're thinking about, what's bubbling up for you. And then I do want to open up for maybe like 2 or 3 questions before we close out. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big believer in a coaching approach to leadership. I think coaching can be embedded in evaluation and is 9 times out of 10 more catalytic and more capacity building than evaluation. And so I think building our muscle at coaching conversations with teachers is really important. And in particular, there's a piece of curriculum that my colleagues and I do that's called Becoming a Warm Demander for Equity. I actually wrote an article in Educational Leadership magazine last year about this. But it's a way to leverage coaching around equity conversations and to, instead of sort of calling teachers out when we see an inequitable practice, really calling them in to who they want to be as teachers, to kind of their best version of themselves. And so there's a lot underneath that, but I think this is a time to build that muscle. You know, a lot of kids' learning and lives are kind of in the balance right now. And so we have to be courageous enough to start having those conversations with teachers when we see inequitable practices, you know, showing up in the classroom. I think creating a lot of space for community building, relationship, reconnection, and healing. I think offering prompts that allow for students and adults to surface what their experience has been, what's been challenging for them, what they need to kind of reconnect to school and thrive and feel engaged again. I think we can't assume that folks are ready to jump back in full bore to curriculum right away. And so really just building in some simple rituals that I've tried to model today, like circles, community circles, dyads, listening dyads are another practice I'm really fond of, to give people space to metabolize the experience they've just been through. That's one thing I would say. And then I think just really keeping our eye on those students and families at the margins and beginning to systematically connect with and listen to them and try to understand what's happening and use it to be responsive, right? Use it to redesign, whether it's, you know, a grading policy, as someone referred to in our small group earlier, that this sort of punitive, there are 8 kids who aren't doing their work, I've got to give them an F even though they had a decent grade before the distance learning began, and really challenging those mindsets and helping our teachers think about how to be flexible and adaptive and caring in an incredibly complex time. Speaking of time, I know we're at the end here. I can field questions offline as well. Y'all are welcome to email me, shane@shanesafir.com. And so I'll just close with a quote by one of my favorites, leaders and thinkers and authors in the work, Margaret Wheatley, who says, when we begin listening to each other and when we talk about things that matter to us, the world begins to change. Everyone has the capacity to be able to figure out how to make a difference. Listening and talking to one another heals our division and makes us brave again. My invitation to you as you go back is to just spend a lot of your time listening and connecting and helping teachers and students listen to one another, because it's that humanization, it's that sense of care and connection that's going to allow them to re-engage instructionally and pedagogically and curricularly. The relationships come first, as someone said a little bit earlier. It's really been a pleasure to spend some time with you all. If you're a Twitter person, tweet a takeaway from this webinar @ShaneSafir so I get to see it, maybe hashtag listening leadership. And just a heads up, my colleague Jamila and I are going to offer a virtual institute at the end of July that is about decolonizing the reopening of school and how do we actually operationalize this idea of relationships before rigor. So consider joining us. If you follow me on Twitter or on my website, you'll be able to get notifications about that. And a couple tools I mentioned today are in the resources section of my website. They're open source, so you can sign on there and get them. Thank you guys so much for your time. I feel such solidarity with British Columbia, and it's just an honor and a privilege to be able to spend time with leaders from the province.